at Whitewall Farm. We're going to be discussing some of the results and some other bits and pieces. If you'd like to go to the agenda, Jade, that would be great. So yeah, today we're going to be talking about the Undersowing Maize. Stephen Woodley is going to be providing the first presentation. And Stephen is from S. Woodley Crop Services, an agronomist and agricultural contractor specialising in soil sampling and precision farming. So Stephen's going to give us a summary of the actual trial. He's done all the hard work with all the soil sampling and porous pots, and we'll be providing sort of the summary to date as it is. There's still a bit more data to come, and we'll make that available in the future. And the next on agenda is Rob Iderson. Rob's a CSFO for Test and Itchin. He joined in October 21, but for the last 20 years before that, he was an agricultural machinery industry and dealing with manufacturers as well. And then we're going to have a little bit of a comfort break, so you can, for about 10 minutes or so, we can all recharge our cups of coffee or cups of tea. And then straight after break, we've got Anne Blockhouse, who is a CSF officer at the moment working for South East Water in the Sussex catchment. And then straight after that, we've got John Morgan from Creedy Associates, who is also the chair of the Maize Growers Association as well. What we'll do, hopefully, if we've got a bit of time after each presentation, we'll have a Q&A session. If not, we'll go straight to the next presentation. But we've got hopefully a little bit of a Q&A session at the end as well. What we hope to do at the end of it is collect all the Q&As, or if anyone else has got any Q&As that you want to send us via email, we'll collect all those together. And we'll put a little fact sheet together with a link to the video as well, and we'll send that out to all attendees and make that available to lots of other people. Finally, I'd probably like to thank Will and Jamie Butler for allowing us to carry out the trial on their farm. It's really appreciated. And hopefully they'll get quite a lot out of this as well in terms of this trial. And hopefully, if successful, they'll scale it up as well on their farm. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Stephen, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. JD, you're going to sort the presentation out.
Yeah, bear with me. I should bring it up.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, so morning everyone. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Stephen Woodley. I'm an independent agronomist based in Sussex, just outside Petworth. And my specialty, or my passion as such, is soils and crop nutrition and everything that goes alongside that. Simon, Deacon and Beth approached me last year with regards to assisting this trial. And I was really keen to get involved right from the start, to be honest. Maize has been probably one of the biggest crops I look after in terms of agronomy, particularly actually on the Isle of Wight. It's the biggest crop that's now grown on the Isle of Wight. And we all know the risks that can be caused by growing it in terms of soil erosion, depletion of soil health, etc. I had a little bit of past experience with people exploring Undersowing Maize, but actually to look at it from an actual trial point of view and understand the benefits that it can bring in terms of nutrient leaching seemed like a good thing to get involved with. So yeah, just reiterating what Simon said, really thanking Jamie and Will Butler letting us use one of their fields as a trial site, and hopefully you guys will see some of these results and see that actually there is some potential to use this on your farm. Jade, next slide, if you could. So what were we actually looking to do? So Undersowing Maize, I mean, there's a whole host of benefits that can be as a direct result of it, but really we were looking at how can we improve water quality and nutrient retention from undersowing a crop of maize with grass. We all know that maize is certainly phosphate and potash hungry. Although phosphate's not a massive issue on the downs in terms of water quality, obviously elsewhere in Sussex and Hampshire, it really is a big issue. So how can undersowing maize improve the water quality, but also can we hang on to some of those nutrients which are left over after harvest? Now, the maize actually did very well this year, but previous years, obviously if we have a particularly dry summer, we don't have much sunlight, kind of a poor crop. We always base our fertiliser recommendations on a good crop. And then when you have a poor crop, inevitably there's more nutrition left afterwards. So by having grass directly growing alongside the maize, we've already got something there, hopefully, to soak up some of those nutrients. So we wanted to try and understand what quantity of nutrients the grass would hold. Next slide, please. So this gives you an idea of original trial layout. So it's downland farm. This field is actually right on top of the downs, so chalky loam soil. And we had originally planned to have 3 sort of trial areas across the field. The bit nearest crossroads was originally going to be undersown with grass. Then we were going to have straight maize or bare stubble as such. And then Will and Jamie indicated that they wanted to have a go with undersown maize with spring beans, which actually, from a agronomy point of view, would have been really quite interesting. So that was the trial that we had envisaged to begin with. Unfortunately, the beans that were drilled alongside the maize actually failed. If you remember back to last year, we had actually a very dry spring, and then we had rain later on in the year. But the beans were outcompeted very quickly, and they failed. So what it actually turned out to be is section 1 and 2. We decided to undersow with grass, and we left plot 3, the bit which is labelled maize and beans, as the control. So that was left as a bare stubble after harvest. So the field was about 4 hectares, so not a huge area, but it lended itself quite nicely to being split. It's all on a slight slope facing northwards. Yeah, no, it was a good site. Next slide, please. So here's a photo of when it was being drilled, just to give you an idea of it. So you can see the sloping to the right-hand side there, and you can just about see where the tractor's wheel marks have got to up on the northern end. That's from there backwards towards the drone as such was the area that was being drilled with grass. Everything further beyond that was left as a control. I wouldn't want to be the sprayer operator in this field. It does look a bit of a challenge having so many short runs, but in terms of the grass being drilled in it, it all went quite well. Next slide, please. So what did we actually look to monitor? So we agreed on the field, we've agreed on what we're going to undersow it with, which in this case was a Italian ryegrass blend. We'd agreed on the drill. What other parameters were we looking at? Well, the starting point really was understanding what's in the soil. So does that field vary in terms of the pK, mag, pH? Have to understand that first to see whether there's an issue either in terms of pH or excessive levels of nutrients, which could affect yield later on. We then carried out deep core soil mineral nitrogen samples in spring 2021, so before the maize was drilled, autumn 2021, so after the maize was cut, and then we've got some due to be taken within the next 4 weeks to try and work out what's possibly been leached over winter. We also installed porous pots over the winter period. I'll come on to those in a little bit later to try and describe the role they have. But in essence, that's looking at what nutrients are washing through the soil profile. So they capture water that's going through the soil, and we then measure it for nitrate content. Every 2 weeks has been quadrat measurements and visual inspections, and then we've got the yield results to include in that too. Next, please. So just to give you a bit of background on the field, so here we've got the soil analysis report. So we've got obviously plot 1, plot 2, plot 3. The field was called top down. pH, phosphate, potash and mag. Very high phosphate levels in this field, and potash levels are near enough on optimum point. Being a livestock farm with quite sizable dairy, wasn't a huge surprise to see some high phosphate levels there. Obviously there's plenty of manure and slurry to go about, so that soil is in very good shape. One thing that's worth noting is when your phosphate levels get beyond 3, phosphate can actually become mobile with the soil sediment. So although this trial initially is looking at actually nitrate retention, by having the grass within the maize, hopefully we are holding some of that sediment back too, which in this case will hold back phosphates. When you get to a phosphate level of sort of 5 and 6, you actually can cause lockup of other nutrients for that crop. It's very difficult to bring that back down. You basically obviously not going to be applying any TSP or any phosphate at all from a bag point of view. But as we know, maize does very well from cattle manure, mainly because of the high potash in it. But as a consequence, we often see that these indices build up quite significantly. Next slide, please. Did I not animate that, Jade? Maybe I didn't. Oh no, that's fine. Leave it at that. That's fine. That's fine. So here's just a picture to give you an idea of how we take soil samples. So it's the bespoke machinery really, which is automated. It does a very good job of taking samples at different depths, and it's all uniform. So it's the same depth every single time. If it doesn't take a full sample, it throws it away. So we really can get some good accuracy in terms of the soil results that we get. So this machine in the picture is actually used for your standard soil analysis, but also soil mineral nitrogen, which is what we'll come on to in the next slide. So soil mineral nitrogen samples. So as I'm sure more and more of you are becoming aware of this, particularly the price of fertilizer this year, soil mineral nitrogen samples are taken down to 2 to 3 depths. So 0 to 30 centimetres and then 30 to 60 centimetres is the depth profile that I tend to use on the downs. If you come off the downs onto the weald, that will then go down to 90 centimetres. The idea being that we find out how much nitrogen is in the soil before we apply anything. So majority of agronomists use the RB209 method, which takes into account rainfall and soil type and previous crop. I do use that, but I also do a lot of soil mineral nitrogen samples to find out exactly where we are before we start. As I said, with the price of fertilizer this year, no one wants to be applying any more than they have to. So by using SMN testing, that gives us a good idea of where we stand. Now, from that, you can see if you just look at the top line, measured soil mineral nitrogen, we've got 3 figures for 3 different plots, and you can see how that varies. Actually, the top-down one, which is closest to the junction, is the thinnest soil, very thin chalk. So I wasn't particularly surprised that that was the lowest. The average for the South Downs, certainly the fields that I test for a winter, would be anywhere between 20 kilos of N in the spring, right up to 90. You do sometimes see more than that, but it tends to be within that range. Those figures are all put in together. We put an account for how much N we think is going to be mineralised during the growing season, and then we end up with soil nitrogen supply index, which you can see towards the bottom there. And that is then used directly to calculate the amount of nitrogen that I would apply to that crop. So in this case, actually, if we were splitting this up into zones, top down 2 would be receiving less nitrogen than top down 1 and 3. In reality, that doesn't always happen. You would actually take, obviously, a SMN figure as 1 across the field. But obviously, it's important for us to record this when we're treating it as 3 replicates as such. Next slide, please. So I just want to put this in here. So these were the samples which were taken, same sort of thing, soil mineral nitrogen. These were the results that were gathered from the sampling in the autumn. So this is now after harvest. Now, if you think back to the previous slide, we had sort of 20 kilos left in top down 1, 50 kilos left in top down 2. I think it was 30 something in top down 3. We can now see the differences here, and you can see the difference in soil profiles. So if we just look at top down 1, for example, we've got the equivalent of 96 kilograms of nitrogen left in that topsoil, 0 to 30 centimetres. 30 to 60, we're right into the chalk, but we still have 33 kilos of N left. So that says a couple of things to me, really. One is, it asks the question, did we over-apply the nitrogen to the crop? Possibly. Did the crop not yield to its maximum performance? That could be the other reason. With all the min-N soil mineral nitrogen work that I've done, the weather can have the biggest influence, whether it's on wheat, barley, or anything. As an agronomist, we're obviously aiming for a set yield, whether that's 10 tonnes for wheat or 40 tonnes a hectare for maize. If that crop underperforms down to weather or any other variables, you end up with nitrogen left over. So in this scenario, we've obviously got despite the crop yielding well, we've got an excess of residual nitrogen left after harvest. Next slide, please. Now, remember earlier that I talked about porous pots. So this is just a simple diagram to try and explain how they work. So on the trial site at Whitewall Farm, we have 22 porous pots installed down to a depth of 60 centimetres. So they're drilled into the ground. They're a PVC tube with a ceramic tip. Then it's our job to come around once every 2 weeks and create a vacuum. So with a ceramic tip on the end, they are obviously porous. So we create a vacuum within that tube and it draws water through that ceramic tip into the porous pot. We then come around every 2 weeks, take the samples of water we've collected, get them analysed, and then recharge the porous pot for the following sets of samples that are going to be taken 2 weeks later. So these have been carried out since almost straight away after harvest, so October. They're still in the ground now. They're due to come out in the middle of February, I think. And we've obviously built quite a big data set. Now, the idea being is over time, they are monitoring the nutrients which are washing through that soil profile. So they're in at 60 centimetres and they're measuring the nutrients which work their way down and end up at that depth within the water. And they're kind of the best tool that we have to measure nitrate leaching from a field level. Obviously, combining this with soil mineral nitrogen results adds a bit more data to it, but in terms of repeated analysis, this is the best option that we have. Next slide, please, Jade. So here's just some results so far. So as Simon said, the trial is ongoing. There will be a full report created from this, as well as a one-pager, which will be shared, and obviously my contact details if people want to get in touch with me and ask any questions. But here's just some examples. These were actually taken in October, these photos. So you can see the level of grass establishment that we had, a really good stand. It travelled well when it was harvested. It didn't interfere with the forager header at all. And coming out of harvest, we had already a really well established cover crop as such in place. Where we compare that with control, there isn't anything there. So from a soil health point of view as well, having grass and a living organism there would be far superior. I'm yet to fully analyse the yield maps. The contractor involved in this has agreed to share them with me. And once he does, we can look at that and see whether there's any yield impact. Certainly from a visual point of view, there was no obvious difference between where the grass was drilled and where it's left as a control. Yeah, that'd be interesting to finish that piece of work off. Next slide, please, Beth. Sorry, Jade. So porous pots. So what are the results so far? So here's quite a straightforward graph trying to demonstrate the differences. Now the grey bar is the stubble. So that is the area which didn't have any grass drilled. The figure on the left is the nice nitrate concentration. So this is how many milligrams of nitrate are within a litre of water. Now, the orange and blue were the two plots which had grass drilled. The orange was the middle section, if you remember back to the map at the beginning, and the blue is towards the crossroads, so the southern end of the field, and the real thin chalk. Now, you can see that there's actually a massive difference there between the area which had grass and the area which has been left as a bare stubble. So straight away, I can see a big benefit in terms of port supporters' aims and also holding on to that nitrate for future crop use. So that's really encouraging to see that so far. Like I said, we've got a couple more rounds of porous pots sampling to do, and then we will overlay this with the soil mineral nitrogen sampling data, the yield data, etc., to really build a full picture. But certainly the results so far are encouraging. Next slide, please, Jade. So that's a real snapshot from me of what I've done in terms of the trial setup, how we've been monitoring it so far, and where we've got to. Just a few take-home messages for me really is establishment as early as 6 leaf stage is essential. So I was speaking to the contractor sort of every other day at this point, trying to make sure that we've got the timing absolutely right. We just got it. If it'd been a week later, I think we would have struggled. The maize would have been too tall. We know that there are significant levels of nitrogen left after harvest from the soil mineral nitrogen samples. So we need to obviously drill into that a little bit further, find out how did we overdo the nitrogen applications? Was the yield disappointing overall? What caused that to happen? And then in terms of how the undersown maize has performed in terms of nitrate retention, the average across the season was a 58% reduction in nitrate ending up in those porous pots. So that has got the potential of being a huge saving, not only for nitrogen carryover into the following crop, so a cutback for the farm, but also in terms of Portsmouth Water's goals, this is something that could really help achieve improved water quality. So there's a snapshot from me in terms of what we've done so far. I'll welcome anyone with any questions. I see, John, you've put your hand up. I'm not quite sure how to work that on Teams, but welcome to just speak up. And Jamie as well.
Yeah, just before we come to John, I'd just like to chip in if that's all right, Stephen. I think, I think from what Stephen said right throughout it, the one thing that we didn't get across at the beginning is in terms of where Portsmouth Water are coming from is we have very high nitrates in our groundwater, and our groundwater is our main supply for drinking water to the populace. And Portsmouth Water's aim in terms of our catchment work is to reduce those nitrate levels through lots and lots of different things, particularly precision farming. But what we found over the last 3 or 4 years, particularly with working with Stephen and other pilot trials, he's actually putting cover crops and now putting grass into maize, is this quite huge reduction of nitrate leaching. Yes, there are quite large results that we saw in the previous graph. They do dilute as they go down to groundwater, but the main thing is to start reducing the nitrate leaching into groundwater, and hopefully over the years, because it does take years, the nitrate levels will reduce in our catchments. And the reason for that is nitrate is really expensive to treat at source. So what we want to do is a sustainable approach to reducing nitrate levels through catchment measures. And this has shown hopefully that actually growing grass within maize is one solution, along many other crops on that one. John, do you want to come in? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, I do. Yes, thanks. And Stephen, thanks ever so much for that. It was a really good summary. Learned a lot, so thank you. I just really would like to ask a question about your soil mineral nitrogen testing, particularly that the kind of assumed 15 kilos mineralization figure. I wonder, where's that come from, and is that a maize specific figure, or is that a figure that you would kind of assume for any?
Yeah. Good question, John, and thank you for the kind words. Yeah, mineralization figure. So just to put a bit of meat in my bones with that figure is basically how much nitrogen IFO is going to become available naturally within that soil over the summer. So as the soil begins to warm up, the bacteria and microbes in the soil get more active and they break down organic matter, etc., and convert organic forms of nitrogen into an available form of nitrogen. That is what we call basically the net end mineralization process. Now, two things that affect it. One is organic matter levels in the soil, and the other one is the history of the field in terms of organic manure applications or compost, etc. If I'm absolutely honest, John, it's a very hard figure to predict. So for me, a field which has got a deep clay loam, or a field which has got a history with large amounts of compost, I would put a figure of 30 to 35 kilos N mineralization there. But to be honest, on the downs, we're probably going to be fairly limited. So I put in a figure of 15 kilos almost on all the fields that I test for that. Like I said, unless I've got a history of large amounts of compost, etc., to be applied. It's something that you can't measure it. So it is an agronomist's interpretation that makes that figure.
Okay, so just coming back briefly on that, my suspicion is, and the MJ work would suggest, that because of the unique nature of maize, that it's growing through, so it's taking nitrogen up through June, July, and to a certain extent August, when many other crops are not, they're senescing and they're not taking up nutrient, that soil provided nitrogen is significantly higher than the 15 kilos. Yeah, and I'll talk a bit about later when I get to kind of the nitrogen work I wanted to talk about, but I suspect that is one of the reasons why you're seeing those higher nitrogen levels in the autumn, is that we're not recognizing how much soil released nitrogen is.
That's a very interesting point, and if that is the case, then that obviously also leads on to the fact that maybe we're guilty, I'm not pointing the finger at Jamie here at all, but myself and other agronomists, and probably over applying N on maize. But it's a very hard figure to predict because you don't know what the season's going to do.
Yeah, and I'm as guilty as you are, Stephen. So don't worry, and I'll explain why that later. So it's a
that's a very interesting point, though. Thank you.
Right, Jamie, would you like to ask a question?
Hi there. Sorry, you'll have to forgive me a little bit because I tend to do the sort of dairy and the cows and the people side of the business, not the arable. So if my questions are a little bit ignorant, forgive me. But one of them was what the difference between the grass 2 and grass 3. I missed that. What was the?
Oh, sure, Jamie. There virtually is no difference. The reason why they're labelled 1, 2, and 3 is that just for me marks whereabouts in the field those pictures were taken. So they're the transets. So grass. I split it up and GPS pointed where those quadrats are taken. So yeah, that figure doesn't mean a lot really in terms of the differences. It's just for me for repetition.
Okay, but there was a difference in the quality of the grass in those areas.
Yeah, if you go back to them, Jay, I don't know if you can show them, Jay, but the grass quality over the field, there isn't a huge difference. If it looks different, it's either because it's probably been driven on.
Oh, okay.
In terms of the actual plant stand, as far as I was concerned, it was pretty even, or even perhaps it's the light in that photo.
Okay, yeah. So grass 2 just looks a bit wider, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does look slightly wider. I mean, that's one thing to point out. The drill that was used in this scenario is hand steered.
Right. Okay.
So it wasn't on GPS, and particularly that field was slightly challenging for the operator because, of course, it's got quite large headlands.
Yeah.
The narrow long shape of it as such. So he was hand steering it. So there will be a slight bit of wobble.
Yeah.
It's probably what we're seeing in grass 2 compared to grass 3.
So just a bit of background on the agronomy and crop that I know. The crop came off at just under 17 tonne an acre, which wasn't too bad for the field.
No, very good for up there. Yeah.
So there shouldn't have been a lot of nutrient washout from a poor yield.
No.
And we tend to put on the final sort of stages of the nitrogen application on our maize have more recently been foliar rather than soil based.
So you're using E28, aren't you, as the last?
Yes. Yeah. Is it Ephesus or something? Yes. Yeah. So we're putting that on. But quite interesting. On another field, we did a sap analysis a week before we actually applied the nitrogen. Unfortunately, the result came back too late. But actually, the sap analysis suggested the plant was absolutely full of nitrogen, and we didn't actually need to put anything on at all. So we intend to do much more of that this year, so that we're analysing what we need as we go.
Yeah, it's really good.
Excellent. That's a good tactic. I mean, it's very difficult. Nitrogen is, a whole subject, but from a agronomy point of view, it is very difficult because the weather has so much to do with it, and you can't predict it. I mean, last year, I'm going slightly off topic here, but just with a crop of wheat, for example, I did a trial of 3 different applications, different rates, different timings, different splits. And it didn't make any difference what you did to the crop yield or protein. It just left more after harvest the more you put on.
Right.
If you had a different year, that would have been a completely different result.
Yeah. So it's difficult to predict.
It's very difficult to predict. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's really valid. That's very valid input. And maybe when I catch up with yourself and Will in person, it'd be good to see them.
Right.
Thanks,
Jamie. Thanks, Steve. One last question before we move on. What's the next crop planned in the field?
The next crop in the field, we're going to go into maize again.
Maize again, so back-to-back maize. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that wasn't the plan, but I think because of the trial that it made sense to do that.
Yeah,
right.
Because otherwise we'd be playing up all the
grass
nitrogen stuff, but fairly soon, and we didn't really want to be doing that.
Yeah, sure. Okay, great. Thanks. Right, we're going to move on to the next speaker. It's Rob Iderson. Over to you, Rob.
Lovely job. Thank you very much. Okay, just a very quick introduction. I know it's already been made slightly, but I've been with Natural England now as CSFO for the test and itching since last October, and previously from a farm management, and then last 20 years working with farm machinery, both domestically and overseas, working with manufacturers and the dealer network. And I've been asked just to talk to you about the establishment techniques to achieve the grass establishment in this specific trial. So Jade, if you don't mind moving to the next slide. So we are going to look at the specific establishment method on this trial, but I thought it would be worthwhile looking at some of the broader establishment techniques. For the first time in 20 years, I'm not trying to sell anybody anything. I'm talking about the whole process, so we don't have to look at the intricacies of the key performance indicators on these machines, but we look at what we can achieve and keeping the efficiencies in establishment. So next slide, please, Jay. So there are all sorts of ways you can establish grass seed in a standing crop, as most of us will be aware. And they all have some pros and cons. Stephen's already mentioned some that we'll come on to later. And of course, one of the cheapest ways of establishing grass seeds into a standing crop would be to broadcast. And if we just look at some of those kind of pros and cons, the challenge you have there is that it's a very inaccurate way of establishing a grass seed. You can't achieve any moisture retention. So we've talked about, particularly in maize, establishing mid to late spring. The chances are that we've seen some really dry spells for maize establishment. And I think it was mentioned about the beans not establishing. I'm not sure when they were drilled, but there is a high risk. So if you're just broadcasting a very small seed that's really looking to scavenge a bit of moisture and a bit of soil seed contact, broadcasting it is obviously not going to achieve that. Also, there's excessive waste. A standing crop of maize, a lot of the grass seed will be caught in the leaf pockets. A lot will be surface sown, and therefore it's an extremely low germination. Obviously, the advantages are that it's quick, it's very cheap, and the potential is that you've got very little damage to the standing crop because there's no mechanical interference with the standing crop itself. So there's an option, but not preferred. And I think where we are scrutinising every penny we spend to try and maintain some kind of profitability in this, we can't afford to be throwing seed which isn't going to germinate and establish. We can use the Einbocktine harrow with a microseeder. This does actually, it's still relatively quick. It's relatively inexpensive. It does give you some soil seed contact. It does actually promote a little bit of mineralization of N. So therefore, if there is some moisture in there, those seeds do tend to germinate. So we get better germination. And because it's broadcast in a wider area, you get a better coverage. And we'll talk about why that might be important a little later. Of course, one of the downsides of that is that mechanically you are rubbing across the standing crop, causing damage. And if your timing is not really prompt, of course, you can cause more damage than you're doing good. Very little moisture retention. In fact, you're going to volatilize even more moisture by making disturbance in the soil surface. And there's always a risk of is susceptibility of just moving and reactivating some residual herbicides that might have been in there. So the chances of getting a bit of damping off obviously can be increased. So so it can be done, has been practiced. A colleague of mine tried a trial with this some years ago, and to a degree of success, but not the precision that I think we're looking for in today's tight budgets that we're working on. Next slide, please, Jade. I did a bit of homework on this because I'm familiar with the actual application that was made on this trial, but I thought I'd see what the wider community were doing, and I did find there's a self-propelled machine that you can see there. I think it's an AgriFac machine, obviously really quick, quite accurate, subject to whether it's done with GPS and it's established, you know, in a professional manner. Very little damage to the crop, but I would say it's very expensive. I'm not familiar with that product in the UK. Because of the width of the machine, it has fewer coulters for inter-row, so therefore the establishment is going to be a narrower band of seeding. And unless there's somebody going to do this in the UK, obviously the availability, and we've already heard how timing is critical. And again, we'll look at that in a moment. There's quite a lot of information in the Farmers Weekly about this, an improvised front-mounted system. Again, can be done very cheaply on farm. Of course, it's versatile, it's on farm, you're not bringing a contractor in, so your timing can be delivered. However, I'd say it's pretty robust, and it might damage the crop. Again, with this particular system, with a microseeder on a modified harrow bar, it's again going to be affecting the moisture retention in that soil, and again, the same issues as the Einbach type harrow. The next slide, please, Jade. So for this site, and Stephen's already mentioned it, obviously a disc coulter drill is the chosen method, and we're going to look at how that application was actually made and any of the lessons that were learned from that. So next slide, please, Jade. The chosen drill is a Solitaire 9 from Lemkin. As I say, I'm not promoting any particular one manufacturer, and we're talking about the principles, so forget the colour and the name on the side, but we will talk specifically about the principles involved with this type of machine. The advantage of taking a Solitaire 9, for example, is the fact that the actual machine used is ordinarily worked in combination with a cultivator element, whether that's a power harrow or a tined cultivator. And in this circumstances, the cultivation element is removed, and therefore, because of the nature of the link up and the piggyback nature of this particular product, the picture on your right will show lots of decent clearance, which does allow you to establish a crop much later into a taller crop, creating much less damage. So next slide, please, Jade. Why is a disc coulter preferred? Well, a disc coulter does offer an awful lot better accuracy from seed placement, soil seed contact, accurate target rates achieved. Because most twin disc seed coulters are followed closely by a depth wheel, which also acts as a method of closing the furrow behind the seed, what you're getting is very good soil moisture retention, which obviously promotes good germination. As I've described, the benefit that you have with this is that you can adjust the coulter widths to suit your spacings. Particularly with this machine, you have good clearance because of the step nature in the actual toolbar. And I think one of the benefits is that actually these are quite common machines. So one of the challenges is, are we looking to spend an awful lot of money to try and establish a catch crop to protect diffuse nutrient pollution? Well, actually what you want to be able to do is take something off the shelf. This is a common approach that's available in lots of circumstances, and therefore the availability is going to mean that it's more accessible. And down on the left hand side is just trying to illustrate the benefit of working alongside a standing crop. It's accurate, it's efficient, you're getting better germination, and as I say, it's all coming back to cost saving. So next slide, please, Jade. Stephen mentioned that the drilling was done up to the 6 leaf stage. I spoke to Josh, the contractor, and I think the lessons learned are that anything beyond 6 leaf can be detrimental to the crop in potential damage. There's sufficient inter-row light for the establishing small seed to germinate, and therefore it seems to be the kind of critical time for getting establishment. And I think what's important to understand is that, of course, everybody's going to be trying to do the same thing at the same time. So I think it's this opportunity to have a machine which is available for other practices on the farm, perhaps, or a neighbouring farm, that does give us the benefit of having that standard type of machine. Next slide, please, Jay. Are you able to run the drone
One
footage?
moment.
So we are going to look in a bit more detail at some of the lessons learned, and Stephen's already mentioned the fact that, you know, there's a bit of a slope on this field, and I discussed with the contractor about the fact that I could see he's got Green Star on his cab, and obviously in an ideal scenario you'd be using the technology we have today with GPS so that the accuracy of inter-row planting can protect the standing crop and make sure that you've got the drills in the right place. However, because of the headland nature of this, and also we're going to talk about the impact of the sidling ground, it's actually easier for the contractor to drive by eye, and that's why I think when people are making their own design of machine, they tend to stick it on the front because actually it's much easier to see. But I think what we can see there is that actually it's quite a speedy, efficient, and a precise application, which I think is really what we should be looking for. Next slide, please, Jay. How does it look in the field? So I had the pleasure of going to visit this site on the 20th of January, and some beautiful sunshine, a bit of frost on the ground, and I'd not been on site before. And I was really pleasantly surprised with the outcome. So to the left, you can see how well that grass is established into row. The coulters were set around 18 centimetres apart for the seeder, within a maize drill of 75 centimetre spacings. And the tillering of that grass has really begun to fill in that whole process. So partly the reason I asked the question as to what happens next with this field, of course, you know, this field would be available to be grazed. There's sufficient grass in there to make it a potential grazing field. There is obviously the challenge of what do you do with the grass if you're going to go into this field with a following crop, but effectively, in establishment of a grass cultivar which is capturing the nutrients, this is certainly looking from an aesthetic perspective to have achieved what we're looking for. And if we go to the next slide, Jade, it's really evident when you stand in the field. So on the left-hand side, we're kind of stood down the bottom end of the field looking up towards the control, which has no seed establishment, and the contrast is obvious. And actually, I think it's really critical that you can see that there was very little damage to the standing crop, so yield impact by having a competitive companion crop was very low. In discussion with the contractor, I think the cultivar choice in grass really is down to you and your local agronomist, but my understanding is in some circumstances that some grasses are keen to send up lots of green leaf area and less keen to establish a good root structure, and there are obviously those that do the contrary. And actually the benefit to this process would be if you can get a good root structure which is scavenging for the plant. As soon as it's harvested, then that will very quickly take off. And obviously with the light infiltration, a good sward of well-tilled grass comes very quickly afterwards. Obviously I wasn't on site directly post-harvesting, so I don't know what it looked like then, but I would say this definitely seems to be achieving a positive outcome for a good grass cover, which is well established right across the board. So if we go to the next slide, please, Jade, which is my final slide. It was interesting having spoken to the contractor and just learning some of the challenges. So we've mentioned the fact that maize crops up to 6 leaves can be established into. They're robust enough to cope with the disturbance of an inter-row drill without any detriment apparently to yield. One of the challenges is that with a 4-metre drill, it's quite challenging. So, for example, turning on headlands without causing wheeling damage, obviously the wider you go, the easier it is to turn on the headland. But of course, the wider you go, the more risk you have of damaging a standing crop if it doesn't match the same width of the drill that the maize was established in. One of the big challenges is I'm afraid I'm an agriculturalist, so excuse my terminology, crabbing on sidling ground. That can mean a potential offset from the front of the tractor to the rear of a drill, particularly one that's designed to be mounted onto a cultivator, can be up to 30 centimetres. So we're obviously encouraging everybody not to drill up and down the hill because of the sediment loss and the pollution, higher increased pollution risks. But as soon as you go onto sidling ground, obviously the stability, but the offset can cause a challenge for inter-row drilling in maize. Again, maintaining coulter pressure, once you've removed the cultivation element of a machine like this, maintaining coulter pressure, which is not massively important on establishing grass seed, but is also a challenge because obviously the geometry of the machine is designed to be working off of a heavy cultivator that's likely to be in the ground. And we talked about the guidance system, really useful in ideal situations, but can't always be used. So the accuracy can really cause a bit of an issue. So really what we're looking at is trying to find a machine that can adapt to inter-row seeding. Of course, most trailed cultivator type drills will have some form of consolidation method in it. So if it's a trailed drill, so they're not suited to this because a standing crop, it would be rolled flat. So this mounted type of drill does establish well in these circumstances, and of course can be precision. And I think in our practices today, precision is key. We want to plant the right amount of seed in the right place at the right cost, and I think that a solitaire light drill certainly is proving to be able to do that in this circumstance. Next slide, Jade, I think brings me quite swiftly to the end, but I welcome any questions if you have any.
Thanks, Rob. Really appreciated. Great presentation there. Is there any questions still? Jamie?
Sorry, just unmuting myself. Just interested in what to do next in terms of we obviously got the grass established there. One possibility, and I don't know what anyone thinks of it, is to knock the grass back either mechanically or chemically, but not kill it, and re-drill into it and see what happens. Because you might get the same effect again.
Sorry, Jamie, just from an agronomy point of view, I would be nervous doing that. 2 reasons. One is obviously, as you know, maize is extremely feeble when it's first drilled. So actually the competition that that grass will put against the maize is likely to affect the yield. The other thing I'd be worried about is the grass actually going to seed, which then might be an issue for following crops. Obviously, we spend a lot of time trying to keep grass seeds or grass weeds out of cereals. That could be a bit of a challenge.
Okay.
John?
Jamie, I'd go one step further than Stephen. I'd say don't even think about it for all the reasons he said. the risk of competition in that first 6 weeks of the maize is huge, and that's why in effect we've focused on this kind of 6-leaf type stage. The maize is away, the grass will never outcompete it, or shouldn't outcompete it, and you kind of get the best of both worlds. But that first 6 weeks is really vulnerable.
Brilliant. Okay, go you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I know Anne's presentation will talk about some other options that have been used in the southeast. Some farmers have actually kept the grass on and actually use that as a secondary crop, which is really good. But yeah, Matthew, question?
Yeah, just a quick question. We're organic. We currently grow 200 acres of maize, achieves 13 tonnes to the acre. Looking at to change our system, currently weed control, we use a Garford hoe, and then we're looking to probably undersow grass into maize this year with that. The other option that I've got is red clover lays that I've got to come up. So I was going to have a trial with a strip till and see where we get with that, only on a small area. Is there anybody growing sort of putting a grass lay down in the autumn and strip tilling in the spring?
John? Okay, yeah, Matthew, yeah. It's an interesting question that is asked kind of quite often, is can we drill into an established understory? The same concerns exist in terms of the competition in that first 6 weeks of the maize crop's life. Historically, it was done more successfully than probably now, and you're going to still have this challenge, I hasten to add, being organic, but there were some chemical options that would slow down the understory for that vital month, 6 weeks. So that allowed the maize to get away, and then the understory would recover. So I'd be nervous. The issue, the understory I would probably choose clover is probably the better of options out there, because it is, you can knock it back quite hard and it will recover. But I think you really do need to hammer that understory to give your maize its month, 6 weeks with minimal competition. So I'd be nervous, but if I were going to do it, I would be looking at a softer crop. Grass is incredibly tough. So I would be nervous of doing it into grass, but I'd be keener to have a look at it into a red clover, white clover type understory. But I'd hammer the clover.
Well, I'm going to do a small area this year of about probably 10 acres to see if it works, really. And obviously I'll take a first cut off for silage and then go in with a strip till. I mean, people are telling me that you should work the ground twice with a strip till before drilling, but it's all about learning, I suppose.
One thing we're looking at, Matthew, is looking at a living mulch, a clover sort of trial, hopefully this year or next year. And one of them was, using clover on that one. So yeah, I think there's a lot more research going into that. And I know, there's quite a lot on webinars and on the internet on sort of living mulch, but using different crops, mainly in wheat, I think.
Matthew, just to add to that. So I work with a couple of organic farms down in Sussex as well, dairies, and some conventionals. And I've got one conventional dairy which they take a first cut of silage off early doors, and then they'll pull it up and go straight into maize. And they've done that for the last 10 years. For 2 years in a row, I had a maize fail after that. And the reason being that grass pulled every bit of moisture out of that soil before it was cut and destroyed. So the only thing to be aware of is if we have a very dry spring, and even if you're strip tilling it, that maize is going to be, the grass is going to be fighting that maize for the same water. You may well have success if you get the weather right, but just be conscious if it's a particularly dry spring, that is quite a big risk.
Thank you.
So Matthew, I have done some work where we've established directing with strip till drills that now many manufacturers do actually put a sward cutting disc in front so that it actually opens a direct slot, ready for that. It can be done, but I just second what Stephen said. The challenge is, depending on how long a lay it's been, obviously you've got some really super structure, but it can be quite dry, and it can be there's some challenges getting that back down again is really important. So consolidation afterwards is probably as critical as actually getting
contact. Yeah, I get that. On the system that we're running at the moment, it is currently putting maize in. Obviously, your competitions, your weeds, and getting that crop established and up is very expensive. I mean, we spend £6,000 a year just on root patrol, just to getting that crop out the ground, and once it's up and it's going, it's fine, and then it's getting as close as you can to the plant itself to clean the weeds up. It's crucial, but everything's challenging. I just thought go about it in a different way, but moisture retention is very important too, because ultimately I can see Stephen's point at the end of the day that if you don't get if it's not wet in May, June, July, your grass is going to be taking up most of that moisture, isn't it? And try and get that plant away is going to be a challenge.
John?
Just a quick comment, Matthew, on your last statement. I would suggest a lot of weed control needs to be done before you get your Garford out of the shed. The harrow, the grass harrow type stale seed bed, which you'll be used to, I'm sure, is very effective at kind of just taking out the bulk of the weed challenge.
We do blind weed. Obviously, straight away we've got a Oppico 12 metre with a feeder on there, and we go over there sort of 5 or 6 times, depending on what you see really. I mean, the biggest challenge I had last year was that we had a very dry spring, didn't we? And we were looking, so we planted the maize a little bit deeper, and then of course then you got the challenge of the weeds coming up, but we got there in the end, and on average we did 13 tonnes to the acre, so really good.
Great, thank you very much, everyone. We're gonna have a short break now for 10 minutes. If we come back about 11:10, and go and recharge your cups, and then we'll hand over to Anne, who will give a presentation then. Okay,
Simon,
yep.
Just quickly, I'm going to keep the recording going if that's okay.
Sure, no problem. Okay.
Thanks all.
Hi, Simon.
Hi, John.
Oh, 2 great papers, weren't they?
Yeah, they're really good. Really good.
Really good.
Yeah, it's good to see the different types of equipment as well that could be used.
Yeah, I mean, I think all the work that we've done, and far more importantly, all the work that's been done on the continent would 100% back up the technique used. It's so much more reliable about getting compared to some of the others. Broadcasting will work if the weather's right, but you can't beat that soil seed contact that was described.
Yeah, it was a question for Rob actually. Is or Stephen is how busy was Josh in terms of using that bit of kit? Was he busy using it all around the country?
Well, that was one of the interesting things from it. It's a different make of kit than ones that we would typically see and probably recommend, which are purpose-built bits of kit. So to have, I need to learn more about the kit that's out there, because that machine seems to have done a great job. And by the sound of it, there are more of those around than there are of the perhaps weaving drills that we would tend to automatically gravitate to. But that shows someone who's not an arable farmer, but therefore is doing what he's told rather than looking for himself.
Yeah, I know Anne will probably show some bits of kit that they used in the southeast. So yeah, on that one. We're just about to start. I don't know if everyone's back at all. I've got a quick question for Jamie, if that's okay. Jamie, did you see much runoff at all on these fields in heavy rain?
Not that I was up there walking them daily, but no, not really. Not on that field.
Not on that field. Do you generally get runoff when you grow maize?
Some of the steeper fields that we do down in the valley, but this year every maize field has got a cover crop in it.
Right, got you. Great. Okay, that's good news. Great. Right, everyone, we're going to start again. We're going to start on the second part of the webinar today. So, Jodie, if you'd like to hand over to Anne, that would be great.
Yeah, hi. So my name is Anne Blockhus, and I am currently seconded into South East Water, working on their catchment management project. I am also...
Simon, sorry, it's John. Well, Jade, have you turned on the recording again?
Oh, I didn't stop the recording, John. We're good to go.
All right, sorry.
That's all right.
Sorry, Anne.
That's okay. Yeah, so I'm a catchment advisor working on South East Water's catchment management project, but I'm seconded in from Natural England, so I'm working on the partnership between those two organisations and the Catchment Sensitive Farming project. So I've been asked along to talk to you a bit about South East Water's approach to maize management, because South East Water has now been running a maize management project for about 6 years. So not all of that time has been with undersowing, but hopefully we have got some experience and some kind of findings and learnings along the way that may be useful for you as well. So if we can go to the second slide, please. This just shows the kind of area that South East Water covers. So the blue areas are where drinking water is provided by South East Water, and then those orange areas are the ones where we have an active catchment management programme at the moment. And I'm working in the ones in Sussex, so you might be able to see Ouse, Cookmere, Waller's Haven there. Those are the catchments where the maize project is currently focused. So what I should say is those are all 3 surface water catchments. So there are some differences between our work and probably the work in your area. These are all rivers with particular water quality issues, and that's why we're focusing on them. So if we can go to the next slide, please. The main reason why we're focusing on maize is actually because of turbidity, so suspended sediment particles in our watercourses. Similarly to what Simon was saying earlier with nitrates, this, it's a cost for water companies to treat it before the water can be used for drinking water. But it's also not great for the habitat of in the river, for wildlife, and generally can also lead to higher bills for the bill payer because of the water treatment costs. There are a number of different causes of these sediment particles turning up in the watercourses. They're not all agricultural. Includes things like road runoff, but we do know that agriculture is one of the main causes of this soil and sediment wash off into our watercourses. And the main risk, I suppose, is seeing bare fields over winter, and maize can be a really risky crop in terms of soil erosion, as has been mentioned earlier. And I guess one thing to mention here is the soil types over in my part of Sussex are kind of heavy or medium to heavy clay, so slightly different, I think, to your area. So just worth bearing in mind, I suppose, with some of the things I mentioned as we go through. So next slide. So in 2016, South East Water realised that maize management was something they really wanted to focus on, to see how they could work on making maize management in general more sustainable. So a project began in partnership with FWAG South East, and we've also been working very closely with the Maize Growers Association throughout this project. And the first year there was a focus on establishment methods, but then very quickly they moved on to looking at post-harvest establishment of cover crops. So in 2017-18, over the winter there, they looked at a mix of different cover crops, and to kind of conclude really quickly, what they found was that it was not reliable to look at these various different cover crop mixes after maize on this heavy soil. It required really for the maize to be harvested first week of September for that to be kind of really reliable with some of these mixes, and that was unlikely to happen. However, they did see that grass was a reliable cover. So then the next kind of logical step from that was to see whether we could get that grass established earlier. So get the grass established between the rows of maize, so that we could benefit more from that cover earlier on in the autumn. And if we go to the next slide, I think you'll see these are some of the benefits of undersowing that we were hearing about at the time. So both from continental Europe and also from a couple of different projects that had sprung up in the UK at the time. So obviously the key driver from our point of view was retention of soil, but also nutrients. We do have issues with both phosphates and nitrates actually in our watercourses as well. And there were obviously a raft of other benefits. The EFA isn't so relevant anymore, but the compliance generally with farming rules for water is still relevant, and some practical benefits for farmers in terms of additional potential for additional winter or spring grazing, and the better water infiltration, making the fields kind of more travelable if required. And of course, you may not see it so much in 1 year, but that building of soil fertility and organic matter over the years with this kind of practice. So these were the kind of things we were hoping to see, but we wanted to test whether this would also happen on our kind of heavier soils in East Sussex. So if we can go to the next slide, please. In 2018-19, over that autumn and winter, we tested whether undersowing could work, and actually that demonstration was very successful, and successful enough that we felt we were definitely seeing some of those benefits. Water infiltration, for example, was very obvious actually during that trial, that was far better in the areas that were undersown. And we did look at sort of sediment at the bottom of the fields and in the trial as well. So it was successful enough that in 2019 we first started trialling incentive payments, and we had 2 different types of payments. So one for undersowing maize with grass, and one for establishing grass after maize. And in fact, we had 2 different levels initially of that first one. We then went back and interviewed the farmers that had taken part, and tweaked our offer slightly based on that. So that first year in 2019-20, we actually only had 1 maize grower who took us up on the undersowing offer, and it was actually a different one than the one where the demonstration took place. And then we had about 7 maize growers who chose the post-harvest grass option. And what happened was it was quite a wet autumn, and some of them struggled to get the post-harvest grass established in time. So they ended up actually moving in more. There was much more interest in 2020 in establishing inter-row or undersown grass. So several of these growers shifted to that option, and also as a result of that wet autumn in 2019-20, we tweaked our offer to say that any post-harvest grass had to be established by the 15th of October with a 1st of October harvest. We did initially also have a slightly later option, which we just removed because on our kind of heavy soils, we found that could actually do more harm than good, establishing the grass so late. So where we're at now, over the last 2 years, we've had a fairly stable number of growers, which is about 12 maize growers at the moment, which it's not a huge number, but we also don't have a huge number of maize growers in our area. So there's really only a couple of more maize growers that we would like to see get fully involved in the scheme. The areas differ a bit year to year because we have some maize growers who are growing maize continuously, and others which are moving certain fields into winter wheat with earlier varieties. But generally, we are seeing that the last 2 years we've had a fairly stable a level of interest. In terms of practicalities, our incentive scheme has no minimum area to sign up. You can sign up, in fact, you have to sign up for just a single growing season at a time. And we've deliberately made the paperwork process very straightforward to encourage growers to sign up to our scheme. So I think on the next slide will show what is currently on offer in our catchment areas. You'll see there are 2 different options of inter-row grass on here. One established at establishment of maize, and the other at this 4 to 6 leaf establishment phase that we've been talking about. We can, to all intents and purposes, we can kind of ignore the first one because actually we do not have any growers who've taken up that option, and we very much recommend the second option. But the reason why we've got the first one on there is we did have a couple of growers just outside of our catchment boundaries who were successful with that first option of establishing the grass at the same time as the maize. And we knew that some of our growers were talking to them initially about that option. So we wanted to leave it open to discussion. But we do very much recommend this 4 to 6 leaf grass establishment time frame. And so the sort of, we tried to keep the specifications very simple, but we do have a few key specifications for people that we really recommend, and that is to stick to that kind of time frame, and also to ensure that grass strips are drilled with a 15 centimetre gap to the maize on either side to try and avoid competition. And then we require that the cover is kept on until at least the 15th of February. But as long as grass growth is good, like you can see in that photo there, we encourage grazing in the winter. and several of our growers are grazing their crop with sheep, and potentially could even do so with young stock as well, actually, in some of these fields, although haven't seen that happen yet. And all of this is very much established in the way that Rob was talking about earlier as well, in terms of drilling rather than broadcasting. I will mention the equipment in a minute, but first we've got a little film clip as well, which is from one of the growers who has been involved in this trial actually for a number of years now. So this video clip is actually from last February, and I will give you a bit of an update after the clip on one thing that he says in the video, which he's actually changed his mind on based on this year's experience. So yeah, we can listen to the clip, and I'll give you a little update afterwards. Hopefully we can listen to the clip. Yeah, okay.
And I don't know if anyone else experienced the same. There's no volume here.
Yeah, can't hear it then, Beth.
You can't. Is that applicable to everyone? Yeah,
Yes, I think
there's
so.
no
Sorry.
sound. Oh no.
Yes.
Sorry guys. Right, okay. Not sure how to.
Jay, can you stay unmuted? Would that work? Because you mute. Yeah, it might be that.
Stay unmuted.
Right, I'll try that again.
Or you muted again, Jade.
So.
No, I can't hear anything.
Okay. I'm not sure why that is.
Jade, you might have to share your screen if it's not already your screen that's being shared.
Yeah, it is my screen that I'm sharing, Jamie. I'm just not sure why the sound. If I take, hold on, let's try this. Can we hear that?
Hi guys, my name's Chris Hamilton. Farming here with my dad Peter. We're a 450 cow dairy herd based near Helsham in Sussex. We are
Oh, we've lost it again, Jade. Yeah, I've lost the sound on it, Jade.
Sorry, guys. I'm not sure why it keeps cutting out.
I think what we'll do is we'll move on from the video and we'll send that out anyway. Or a link to that if Anne can find a link to that.
Yeah.
That we can provide, and yeah, if we move on, that'd be great.
Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, well, I guess, to be honest, I just to mention very briefly, one of the things that he mentions in the video that I think is probably one of the more interesting ones is that, like several of our growers, he chose to undersow some fields with grass, and then he chose to have some fields harvested, and then afterwards the grass went on. And what was quite interesting, I obviously went out there and took a look as well, was in sort of November time, you could see quite a big difference in the grass growth between the undersown grass and the non-undersown. By January, it was a lot less obvious from just looking at it from a top level, but once you actually dug a hole to take a look at the root structure, the undersown grass was really doing a lot more. And so obviously that has much superior benefits in terms of water infiltration, and also in terms of just general soil structure for the kind of the following crop as well, I suppose. So yeah, I hope you'll all get a chance to catch up on the video later, because it is always nice to hear from someone who's actually done it and who's seen the benefits on his farm. So what I was going to say, actually, the one thing that he had changed his mind on, I suppose, is worth mentioning. He says in the video that he had booked in the contractor as late as possible, so as late as possible before the so sort of at that 6 leaf stage. Now this summer, because it was much more kind of intermittently wet, it wasn't that we had so much rainfall, but it was kind of frequently wet in sort of June time when he was looking at undersowing. And he had, I think, booked the contractor towards that end of the period. He really struggled to find a time frame for all of it, so he actually missed out on some of the fields. So thankfully he did have early varieties on and managed to get an early harvest so that he could at least get a good grass cover on afterwards. But I think this year he would probably look to book that contractor in a little bit earlier to give himself an extra week or 10 days, just in case that weather is tricky. That's probably more of an issue in my area than it is yours with our heavier soils, but worth mentioning anyway, I think. So going on to working with contractors and I suppose the drills as well. This, I think John mentioned the weaving drill. We currently now have 3 contractors in our catchment areas. 2 of them have got this weaving drill, and the third one is Josh, who did the drilling actually over at Whitewall Farm. So who's obviously got more of a modified drill. We're finding that all 3 work very well. We haven't heard any or seen any evidence to say that the weaving drill is necessarily better than the other one or the other way around. So yeah, we're very happy that we have all 3 now, because I think starting the project, we did only have the 1 contractor, and obviously with a fairly brief window to get the undersowing done, that can be kind of an obstacle with these projects. We also identified quite early on that one issue with getting this off the ground is that there's plenty of maize growers that are interested, but obviously and completely understandably don't want to go all out with undersowing on the entire farm. But it's also not that worthwhile for contractors to go around doing 3 hectares here and 5 hectares there. So we did also set up a way of incentivizing contractors to carry out those small area drilling slots, so that growers could kind of have the confidence to just try a small area, see how it works out. And obviously for contractors, it tends to work quite well as well, because the growers may well increase that area the following year. But it just gives everyone a little bit of confidence in the first year that it's going to be worth everyone's time. So when I say small areas, we we have a payment for less than 5 hectares and another slightly smaller one for between 5 and 10 hectares. And above that, we kind of think it should be more viable financially without our input. So if we move on to the next slide, I just thought I'd talk briefly about some of the kind of lessons that we've learned and some of the concerns that have been raised with us, and then what we found now after the project has been running for a few years. So obviously weather is often raised, whether it's going to be too dry or too wet, especially during the early parts of summer. And we now have a couple of years where we've had very different weather conditions. So I think we have a little bit of experience with this. So 2020 was incredibly dry, and it did initially look like this would have an effect on undersowing. The grass didn't really seem to be doing very much at all. You could hardly see it on some fields. It was very, very small and wispy. But really, as soon as harvest was over, the grass did completely take off. So we're really not concerned about it being too dry in summer after our experience of 2020, I have to say. Too wet in summer, I think that is more of an issue in terms of what I just mentioned with Chris and a couple of other growers and what they saw in the summer of 2021, where if it's too wet, especially I suppose on our kind of heavier soils, they may struggle to get on a couple of days. But really our advice there is just to expand that contractor window slightly by booking someone in slightly earlier than maybe they would have done. The lack of contractors, I think that is, that's not so much a concern from growers, although people do sometimes query whether they're going to find someone to see them at the right time. But I think we've shown that that is not so much of an issue now that we've got 3 contractors in the area, and I think if that will probably be enough for our project, but if not, I think there is the market in place now to see to that. Herbicide applications, I won't really go into this because I'm obviously not an agronomist, but just to mention that in the early years, we did get some concern from some agronomists about how this was going to work. And what we're seeing is really just that as undersowing is becoming more common, I think agronomists have just become a lot more au fait with the method, and it really is not something that we're hearing anymore as a concern. So I think that's less of an issue. And then I think both from the growers and from our point of view, the number one concern has always been whether we were going to see a yield effect of undersowing. And thankfully, that is something that we have not got any feedback to say that anyone has seen lower yield. There's some very small crop damage sort of around headlands when undersowing, but all the feedback we've been getting is that does bounce back quickly, and that to the extent that it causes yield loss, it's so small that it's kind of negligible in the grand scheme of things. Yeah, the final point there isn't really so much of a concern. It's just a point to say that we would always still advise that people go for early varieties of maize, regardless of whether or not they're planning on undersowing. It just gives greater flexibility in the autumn. And if for some reason the contractor lets you down, there is still that option of getting a decent grass cover on, still second best, but absolutely better than nothing after harvest if an early variety is chosen and harvested at a decent time. So I think, yeah, those are really the kind of key lessons from the project. And really, more or less the end of the presentation, except I think on the final slide, it's just to say that we are continuing to kind of tweak the project as and when feedback suggests that we should. Also, strip till was mentioned earlier. The farmer in the video actually is trialing some strip till cultivation. I say trialing, that's it's not really a trial that we've set up, but he is trying some strip till cultivation, so we're kind of keeping an eye on that. And generally we will be looking to have further knowledge sharing events regularly, so hopefully it's something that can be shared more widely across the region as well, and maybe we can continue to work from each other and work with each other and learn from each other in these areas. So yeah, I think that's it from me, unless anyone's got any questions.
Anne, can I give the video a quick go again just to see?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, right. This should. Not that one again. Hear that? Yeah.
Hi guys, my name's Chris Appleton. I am farming here along with my dad Peter. We're a 450 cow dairy herd based near Helsham in East Sussex. We are farming a fairly heavy clay farm here. So we're a mixture of sort of heavier clay soils, and then closer to the river we're more medium loamy soils over clay. Typically we are a fairly wet farm, but certainly I've been quite surprised at how good the cover crops have been. We've grown 100 acres of maize this year, along with 150 acres off-site. Typically our maize has always been continuous, but certainly the aim in the future is to try and rotate those around a bit more on the farm. This year we've grown 50 acres of undersown grass, and then we've done 50 acres of post-harvest grass. We attempted for the first time to establish 20 acres of maize using via strip tillage rather than our conventional plough and power harrow method. The reasoning behind this really is to try and get away from continuous ploughing, and then also to hopefully establish our maize and reduce the cost of it. We had a local contractor that kindly came over and drilled the crop for us. In the future, we are considering whether it's worth investing in our own equipment to try and bring some of that work in-house. So we had a really good run this year. We actually managed to drill our first fields of maize on the 22nd of April, which meant that we grew a really fantastic crop on those. So our last conventionally drilled field was on the 2nd of May. The strip field maize went in slightly later on the 5th or 6th of May. The earlier drilled maize certainly yielded a lot better, in the region of 20 tonnes to the acre. But of the later drilled conventional and strip tilled maize, both of those yielded fairly similarly. The undersown grass was drilled on the 17th of June. So the advice we've been given was to go in really the last day we could possibly travel. And then the oversown grass we drilled mid-September. We were really happy with the actual establishment process. We felt there was very, very little damage to the crop itself. And certainly we didn't notice any yield difference between that was undersown and that wasn't. We were very fortunate when we actually established the undersown grass. When we established it, we got a fairly decent spell of rain the day after. Then the grass was actually up in the row, certainly within a week of establishment. The actual establishment was really, really good. It was very consistent all through the rows. Once it established, it really sort of sat in a state of suspended animation right through the summer. It didn't look particularly well, but you could see that the grass was all there. And then as soon as we actually harvested in September, all of a sudden there was plenty of light got down to the plant, and now we're looking at really healthy cover crops. For our undersown grass, we established Westerwolds. Really the reason being we were just looking for a grass that was going to establish an effective green cover, hopefully carry on growing over winter. Since harvesting our maize, it's been really interesting watching how these different cover crops have come on. We've just been keeping a very close eye as well on the higher risk areas across the farm in terms of runoff. I'm really pleased to say that despite certainly a very wet autumn and early winter, we haven't seen any significant runoff into our waterways. So I'm quite confident that the green cover is doing its job. In the early part of the winter, I think the unsown grass was doing a much better job of holding on to nutrients, holding onto soil, and doing all of the things that a cover crop ought to do. Now that we're through to the latter part of the winter, I feel that the post-harvest grass is catching up and is certainly, I hope, doing a similar job. Now that we've got a really good green cover established across all of our maize ground, we are starting to move across it with some sheep to graze it off. We started that process in the middle of January, the plan being that hopefully they will eat the cover crops and then free up the nutrition in time for the following maize crop. In terms of actually getting rid of the cover crops, my hope is to leave them growing for as long as we reasonably can. But I expect we'll probably spray them out middle of March. It'll be a balancing act between trying to establish enough green cover to hopefully provide good cover across the soil when we hopefully try and strip till some more maize into them, but also not having too much cover on there, because my suspicion is too much cover will not go very well with the machinery we're using.
Great, thanks Jade. Thanks Anne, really appreciated. I think what we'll do is we'll go straight on to John's presentation, if that's all right. And then if there's any questions for Anne afterwards, we'll take them there. So over to you, John.
Okay, so hopefully you can see the presentation. Can you sign that there?
Yes, I can. Yep.
Okay, great. So thanks so much for asking me to be involved and the maize growers to be involved. My aim is to talk really about sustainable maize growing, but I wanted to kick off really by making the point that maize, in fact, is a great crop, and it's not just me saying that. There are a lot of reasons why that statement can be backed up. Just going to go through them quickly just to kind of sow the seed. The first thing I'd say is that the nutrient or the pattern of nutrient uptake with maize, particularly nitrogen, is very matched to the release of nutrient from manures, organic manures that are often applied to maize. And as we mentioned earlier, there's also a very strong link between the release of soil nitrogen from historic organic matter and maize nitrogen uptake. So it's a really good user of nutrients, and for that reason we need to put far less fertilizer on a crop of maize that will yield similar yields than other crops, because it's so good at using soil nitrogen. Maize is a very low chemical use. We don't really treat much maize with fungicide, and there's some herbicide use, but it's a relatively low level of herbicide. So the agrochemical use for maize is very low. And then finally, the genetics of maize mean it's incredibly effective at using moisture to produce biomass. So it really is a very strong environmental crop. And I would argue it's part of the solution going forward. Maize growing continues to be part of the solution. And it gets some bad press, which I'll try and talk about in a second. In addition to all those pluses, cattle love it as a feed. It is the best crop from which to produce biogas. It has a lot going for it as a crop for the farmers who choose to grow it. A little bit about the MGA, if you don't mind. So the MGA, Maize Growers Association Farmers Organisation, set up over 33 years ago now, 550 so members, the bulk of whom are farmers. Lots of work focusing really on trying to provide growers with independent advice on how to grow and use their maize effectively and efficiently. Increasingly, for obvious reasons, a lot of interest in the sustainability of that maize, both environmentally and financially. Finally, the final sales plug, I suppose. I work part-time for the MJ. My day job is kind of farm management consultancy with a little organisation called Creedy Associates. We have a real specialism in nutrient management, which it will cross over, I think, into today's talk. So maize is a great crop. Please don't lose sight of that when sometimes we hear about the negatives associated with it. We're going to try and address those in the next 20 minutes or so. So my plan of action really is to address the two main challenges that maize growing can pose, talk a bit about site suitability, choosing the most appropriate maize variety if the field is in fact suitable. Talk a bit about drilling, particularly about drilling time of year. A session on nutrient supply for the maize. I will kind of touch on the undersowing versus after sowing debate. Anne's just covered it quite well previously, so I won't go into huge detail, but I've probably got some evidence to very much support the comments she made. A little bit about post-harvest cultivation options and reasons, and then finish off with some conclusions at the end of my session. So let's start off with the challenges posed by maize, and you will have all heard and seen of situations like this. The reality is nothing to do with the maize crop. The maize crop is innocent in this photograph. The issue is heavy machinery driving around on soils that have been weakened by autumn and winter rainfall. You've only got to imagine yourselves picking up and squeezing a wet handful of soil and realizing how weak that soil is. You can squash it, you can compact it, you can end up creating quite a tight ball of soil in your hand, which is very different than if the soil were dry. Dry soils can take a huge amount of weight without structural damage or little structural damage. It's the wet soils that are the issue. So that's the first challenge, is avoiding the need to drive heavy machines around on soils that have been weakened by rainfall. And the second challenge, I tend to call it what I call nutrient overload. And nutrient overload is a result of us applying more nutrient to a field than it can ever, the crop growing can ever use. And maize is because of its ability to take up so much soil nitrogen, is probably more vulnerable to nutrient overload. This is quite an important graph, I would suggest. So this is the 30-year average of rainfall southeast and central England. You can get these graphs all everywhere over the country, and they all look very similar. And the point, I suppose, to recognise, particularly if I get my little marker to show you what I mean. Okay, clearly year on year we get huge variations, but we can't unfortunately farm for those various years. What we can only do is farm for the average. As I say to clients, sometimes you can't farm for Hurricane Katrina, you have to farm for the average. But what we'll find is that over the average season, we typically get a relatively low levels of rainfall through those May, June, July, August, summer months. But typically 30-year average rainfall picks up dramatically during October and maintains relatively high through November and December. So when we're talking about driving heavy machines on soils weakened by water, or the opposite, which is driving heavy machines around on soils that are not weakened by water, we need to be thinking very much of harvesting any crop, driving tractors around at this time of year, not this time of year, because by the time we get here, those soils are weakened and we end up with some severe or risk of severe structural damage. So timing of maize harvest is really important to get it right. When we get it wrong, we end up with some of these kind of scenes. So there's a maize field in East Devon. You can see every trailer mark on that field. It then ends up coming out into the road. Yes, the sediment is an issue in its own right in terms of its damage to the gravels in river courses, but also it often takes phosphate with it, an ag chemical with it, which can do some pretty serious damage in the rivers. It gets quite personal for me at this stage because this is the stream that runs through my garden, and that's my pond at the back of the garden, which each winter is filled with sediment from my wonderful farming neighbours' maize crops. So surprise, surprise, it's quite a hot subject in our household. If we get it right, we end up with, we can harvest maize. In this case, this is an American photo, but I wanted to prove a point. There's actually a lorry driving through the field here. The soil is dry. The soil can take the weight of quite a lot of machinery without compaction and with limited winter runoff as a result. So harvest when soils are dry, which tends to be the first half to mid-September, should most certainly be a target. So second challenge I wanted to talk about was what I call nutrient overload. I'll show you some photographs of suitable applications of manure later on, but this is just yet another example of where it's been overdone. Unfortunately for maize, because of its relatively late drilling time, there is an opportunity for farmers to overspread manure sometimes. And I know this isn't nearly as much the case as it perhaps was in the future, but it does provide a great opportunity to empty stores. And the risk with that is we end up oversupplying nutrient. Talk you through this kind of quite complicated graph, but it's data produced from Wessex Water where they were looking at the nitrogen leaching kilograms per hectare from 4 different crops over quite a lot of different studies and trials. So it was quite a widespread result. And there's lots of stuff going on here, but I would suggest we look at 2 things. We look at that little purple dot, which is the mean, the average nitrate leaching following those crops. And one of the reasons why we're talking about nutrient today is that maize scores quite highly. But again, I would suggest the issue is not the maize is the issue, it's the nutrient management of that maize crop. I think we often over-apply organic manures and we often oversupply nitrogen, but because we don't fully understand the nutrient that's released from the soil. So again, not a maize issue, but associated with overdoing nutrient overload in terms of the maize crop. So nutrient overload, we'll come back to that later on as well. So going back to addressing the first challenge, in terms of suitable fields and harvest date, trying to get harvest in mid-September or early September. Wanted to talk through something we call site suitability. We have a Euro-based service where we can give members advice as to whether a field is suitable, and if it is suitable, what type of maize they should be growing. And we score these fields basically on 8 different categories. So we talk about harvest date, we talk about drilling date, altitude aspect of the fields, soil characteristics. You can see the other elements there, all of which will dictate the riskiness of that field for maize. And if, the lower the risk, the more options farmers have, the higher the risk, the less options, to the point that we would quite often recommend that maize is not suitable in those fields. To give you an example, this is how we would score a farmer's target harvest date. So if the farmer is, for whatever reason, prepared to be contemplating harvesting mid-October, then he would get a negative score. If, as we would encourage him to be harvested in September, he might get a score of 3 or 2. So how that works is that harvest score would appear in that box there, and it would be combined with a similar score for other characteristics, and we would end up with a total score. Now, that score will directly relate to the maturity group of suitable maize varieties. What do I mean by maturity group? So this is a graph taken from the latest variety book published about 3 weeks ago. So what we've got here is we've got different maize varieties, and they've been a lot put into different maturity groups. So maturity group 11, the yellow one there, would be the ones that need the least days to reach maturity, having been planted, and group 5 would need the most days. Now, if you think about it, it makes sense. The ones that are in the ground longer are likely to yield higher. And in fact, I think Smoothie there, the only maturity group 5, has got the highest yield. It's about 105% of the average. There's the average line there. So Smoothie will give you 5% more yield. And at the other end, Ceto, which is 92% of the yield, that's the maturity group 11 variety on this particular graph. But what you'll notice, there's a lot of varieties in the middle here. There's the 9s and the 10s, particularly the 8s and 9s, I should say, which are yielding at the average or slightly above the average. So how this works is that score relates directly to the maturity group, which allows farmers to go and look at the variety tables to choose a suitable variety. One of the challenges, though, that if this scoring system delivers a score of more than 11, you can see that we've got an issue there. That there aren't varieties that have a higher score than 11. And what we're really saying here is we're into the business of, is that field suitable to grow maize? And so I suspect if fields are scoring 12s and 13s and 15s occasionally, then the field is simply not suitable to be growing maize. And the issue there is that we're likely to be harvesting in October, November, when those soils will be wet and the compaction and challenges result. So it's a very real conversation we often have with people. There are alternatives. There's whole crop silage, more grass silage, Italian ryegrass, all things that can be talked about. There is one possible maize alternative, and that's maize under film. So this is a maize drill. It's a few years old, this photograph now, but basically there's maize being drilled under these rolls of film. And what that will do is that will speed up maturity by about nearly 3 weeks. So in effect, it shortens the growing season by 3 weeks, which allows perhaps a field that scored 11 or 12 or 13 on our assessment to come back as a potential maize crop. The film at the moment is not biodegradable, but they are launching, or they're using biodegradable film this year, 2022, for the first time. So there's a real desire to ensure that this film is genuinely biodegradable, not just photodegradable. It works. It works particularly in particularly difficult years. So what we've got here is you've got, how many years? That is 8 years. You've got the yield of uncovered conventional maize versus covered maize. And what you can see is that in every year, there is a yield benefit of using film. This is in kind of Northern Ireland work, so it's in marginal areas. But those benefits in these years here wouldn't justify the extra cost. But in the very difficult years, 2008, 2002, the impact of the covered maize made a huge difference. So that's something for some to think about if they determine to grow maize, but they've got very high risk fields. Okay, conscious of time, I'm going to move on and talk a bit about drilling now. So what you've got here is a photograph of maize drill on the same site directly, exactly 1 month apart. So you've got maize drilled mid-April and you've got maize drilled mid-May. Maize takes needs a fixed number of heat units to go from a seed to mature maize ready for harvest. If you think back to my desire for you to harvest maize in kind of when the soils are dry, realistically first 2 weeks of September, therefore drilling date of maize is vitally important to achieve that. So we need to be thinking very carefully about getting maize drilled as early as is practical. One quick trial result, this is last year's data from some work we did near Shepton Mallet, where we drilled maize at 2 different depths. I'm not going to go into that now, but we did for various reasons. We drilled it at a month apart. So there's the early drilled maize. It yielded more maize and it was more mature. It was 35% dry matter harvest compared to the later drilled maize that did 13 tons compared to the 15, and it was what's that, 8% lower dry matter, which in fact is 4 weeks in our kind of way we calculate it. So early drilled maize in most cases will end up with earlier harvested maize, which reduces the pressure on the soil in the autumn. So drilling date as early as is practical based on soil temperature and soil conditions is really, really important in this kind of sustainable maize exercise. So soil temperatures, 8 degrees, get the maize in the ground, soil conditions allowing. It's no point in muddling maize into wet, difficult soils. Got to get it right. But we should be thinking, particularly in your neck of the woods, of drilling maize, most certainly from the middle of April onwards. We should be targeting mid-April, assuming conditions are right. Moving on to the second of our challenges, nutrient overload. in effect, what we're talking about here is good nutrient management planning. Stephen mentioned it earlier. He does a lot of it. We spend a lot of time doing it with our kind of Creedy Associates hat on. It all really stems from good, accurate soil analysis, and I fully support Stephen's comments about soil nitrogen testing being increasingly popular, and the interest has grown, particularly with fertilizer prices where they are. What happens is we soil test the field, and then we typically end up looking at tables like this. So this is the RB209 table for maize, and we take our soil indexes and we look at this table and we choose the relevant levels of nutrient that we need to apply. I'm going to make two important points, I think, on this slide. The first one is phosphates. Stephen's soil analysis talked to figures of fields, I think fives on phosphate, index 5 and so on. Well, my table doesn't go up to index 5, it goes 4 and higher, and you can see the big fat 0 that is the recommended phosphate for maize. Now, year after year, trial after trial, and we keep doing these phosphate trials, and there is no benefit to the maize crop, both in terms of, particularly in terms of yield, of applying phosphate to crops to fields with indexes of 4 and above. So that's really important, that there are a lot of maize grown with standard starter fertilizer applied, and when you get these higher indexes, it's not necessary. Even when you get down to index 3, the phosphate requirement is very low, and that is nearly always supplied by manure or slurry if they've been applied. So again, we need to be very careful, and it's only really when you get down to the indexes 1s and possibly 2s that starter fertilizer delivers the result that people want it to do. So that's the first thing, phosphate. Beware of phosphate fertilizer if indexes are high. In terms of nitrogen, you'll see at the bottom here, one of the bullet points is that there's a direction, in effect, to take a look at the MGA nitrogen predictor, and I'll talk about that very briefly in a moment. But in effect, what we're saying, what we would argue the MGA is that data is not comprehensive enough, and it's not taking enough account of nutrient uptake of maize, of nitrogen from organic matter. So this is the nitrogen uptake of a maize plant over its growing season. You can see the point I made earlier that July and August, there's a lot of nitrogen being taken up. That nitrogen can be supplied very effectively from organic matter, both applied pre-maize, but also applied historically. And we continue to do trials on this, and we continue to be surprised how little nitrogen, inorganic bag nitrogen maize needs if it's on high organic matter soils. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to keep screaming through, but we can obviously come back to some of these with questions. The MJ Nitrogen Predictor Service, so this is a Bureau service we offer members, and we ask them questions about what they're looking for in terms of maize maturity, when would they aim to harvest, when would they aim to sow. All these elements will come up with and allow us to come up with an individual nitrogen recommendation for a field. Far more complex than that simple table. And we use Manna NPK as a way of quantifying the nutrients supplied from organic manures. Pretty effective. Really good application rates of dung here, just to give you an idea of what we're looking at. We can still see the ground, both of these. These will grow great crops of maize. It doesn't need to be inches thick. It can be relatively thin to supply what we need. Quick signposting, there's lots of help out there for nutrient management. We use this one, Manna NPK. The Farm Crap app is quite a good one as well. There's a lot of stuff out there, and I would urge you to dig it out and have a look, because using manures effectively is a huge opportunity to save cost, particularly bearing in mind current prices. Okay, moving swiftly on to post-harvest management of maize fields. Fantastic trial, is many years old, and it compared the runoff from different treatments post-harvest or around harvest. So there's the conventional compacted maize stubble, shed 228 litres. A post-harvest cover crop, 179 litres of water was collected in this pit at the end. Undersown maize was down to 53 litres, but cultivating the field to encourage infiltration almost completely eliminated. Surface runoff, really effective way of dealing with post-harvest field runoff. The problem is that this one and this one really do nothing in terms of nutrient leaching because there's nothing growing to take it up. So we've moved on from that now, and we now focus on cover cropping. This is an example of cover crop established post-maize. In the distance here, you've got a couple of houses that were regularly filled with soil from this field to much to the homeowners' annoyance. This has completely nailed that. This post-harvest established cover crop is holding that soil. They work. Undersown, we talked a lot about undersowing. I'm not going to talk a lot about it. Two different techniques there, broadcast versus drilling. But I will show this slide, which I think backs up some of the data we've seen already. So this is some work which looked at cumulative nitrogen leaching is on this side of the graph. Different kind of management. So there's your bare stubble, 30 kilos of nitrogen leached over the winter. Post-harvest established crop, cut it down by 6 to 24. But once you start talking with undersowing, and these, to be fair, that was simply added to slurry. This was undersown with a rake. The reductions are significant. We saw that from Anne's work earlier on. This works. There's no question about it. It does exactly what we want it to do. Undersowing reduces nutrient loss. Okay. Backing up also what we've heard earlier, MGA, we're convinced that drilling is the way to do this to get more consistent results time after time. Broadcasting can work. It is cheaper, but there's more often than not, there are far more weather issues, dry soils that doesn't establish. So we like to drill. We like to drill early. This is when you undersow. This is not the maize shouldn't be touching that working bar. It's really young maize. Just a photograph of a kind of one of the various routes out there. So last section, you'll be pleased to know. I wanted to talk a bit about what we call our maize charter. And the maize charter is a way of really to encapsulate all of this sustainable maize growing advice in one little project. So it's focused around a site visit where we risk assess each field using that scoring sheet I talked about earlier. So we provide guidance to the different most suitable varieties, or in some cases the fact that the field isn't suitable. And we also take the opportunity to study and understand the nutrient management of those maize fields, which is, I think, increasingly important, bearing in mind what we're learning in terms of nutrient supply from manures and organic matter. I hope Anne doesn't mind, but I wanted to talk a bit about the project we did with her a couple of years ago now. So I travelled across, I visited farms, spoke to a few of them on Zoom to try and undertake this kind of process. So we scored the fields on their inherent risks, as I talked about. We directed them to the right maturity groups. And we talked a bit about how you might lower a field score. Well, how do you do that? Well, if you set out to drill earlier, you can lower your score. If you set out to harvest earlier, you can impact on the score. So there is something you can do, although to be fair, most of the issues are inherent. And we talk about nutrient management. We talked about post-harvest management. And I wanted to finish off really with this with some photographs of what we picked up. So what we've got here is aftersown versus undersown. This is some photos I took in January, I suppose, 2021, Anne, I think. So we've got undersown here, we've got aftersown. Comment I'd make there is these are on similar farms, most certainly the same couple of days. A lot more ground cover from the undersown versus the aftersown. And as Chris said, the farmer in the photograph, there's much more benefit in October, November, very vulnerable time of year for leaching with undersown compared to aftersown. Someone's mentioned it earlier on, this is a graze with sheep in January versus an ungrazed with sheep. Chris again made the point that they're thinking about grazing their undersown crops. My take on it as a nutrient management specialist is that those sheep are converting a green leaf into urine and dung, which is going to be more available to the following crop. So there is a real benefit in grazing these cover crops in terms of nutrient management. This hasn't got to rot down. It's been grazed and turned into urine. Final photograph. These were other cover crop, undersown crops. I mean, this was a fantastic field to see. Really good, even grass cover. And as we know from the science, that's taken up a lot of nutrient that would otherwise have been leached. So, in conclusion, maize is not the problem. Maize is part of the solution. Maize is a fantastic crop. It uses nutrients very effectively. It has a very low agrochemical use. It is very efficient at converting sunlight into biomass. Maize is not the problem. The issue is, particularly in soil terms, is heavy machinery in wet fields. And that could occur after beans, potatoes, or even with a round feeder tracted round feeding bales of silage. It's all about heavy machinery in wet soils, not necessarily about the maize. Nutrient overload is a problem. Maize is incredibly efficient at taking up nutrients from soil and muck. We often over-apply. There's a huge opportunity there to save money and reduce nitrate leaching particularly. I would encourage you to set out this year to harvest your maize when the soils are likely to be dry. I don't know whether it's going to be a wet year or a dry year. What I do know is the 30-year average says that really up until September, I'm likely to get drier soils than I am once I get into October. So I would love you to harvest maize in September and set out to do that. I think we need to be brave and recognise that some fields aren't suitable for maize. And some form of risk assessment, as I outlined, is important here. There are alternatives, not unfortunately as reliable as maize. Well, I can understand why people want to grow it, but we need to recognise that certain fields are not suitable. Drilling as early as practical. Soil thermometers, soil conditions. Do not try to be greedy and take big cuts of silage in early May and then get maize in afterwards. You're heading for a fall. Maize is the priority. Maize should be drilled as early as is practical, and that will harvest early. Good nutrient management planning, that is maize focused. We need to focus on the uniqueness of maize when we're nutrient planning, not fall into the trap of nutrient management planning for other kind of autumn cereals or even spring cereals. Maize takes up a lot of nutrient in the summer that we need to recognise. Think about what's going to happen to these fields post-harvest, and keep having these conversations. Today, I've learned a lot today. It's been fascinating to hear about the work done yourselves and from Anne, and keep having those conversations. You can't beat seeing and talking about things to give people confidence to do it. So that's me done. I'm more than happy to answer any questions if anyone has any.
Thanks, John. Really appreciated. Have we any questions at all?
That bodes well.
No? Okay. Right. Well, thank you very much for all the presenters today. As said right at the beginning, we'll pull together some of the questions and answers from today, and we'll put together a short fact sheet, some pointers, recommendations from this, and provide that with a video link to this webinar, and we'll send it out to all our partners. Yeah, so it's available so you can watch it again. And to encourage other farmers as well, to actually come and see it and hopefully consider sort of changing their practices, and particularly for us, the water companies, in terms of the environmental benefits that it has for us as well, which is really particularly important on that one. So, no, thank you very much. Jade, anything you'd like to add at all?
No, just thank you ever so much to all our presenters today. It's been really good, and I hope everyone's got something out of it. But yes, I'll ping an email this afternoon with the link, and yeah, do get in touch if you want any sort of follow-up information. or anything wider in terms of catchment sensitive farming. Yeah, but thank you very much.
Great. Yeah, I'd like to thank Jade overall for sort of hosting this and pulling it all together, and making it work. And yeah, great. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a great afternoon, and hopefully we'll catch up with you in the future. Take care. Bye.